Sean, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
I want to start out by saying that I am so honored to have you as a guest contributing to our virtual library. If I could pick the top people that I would want sitting in this chair who have made contributions to the field of grief and awareness, you would be one of them clearly. So I'm really honored and grateful that you're with us today.
Well, that's how I feel about you.
Thank you. Thank you. So now that I've set that expectation, I want people to know what has been this man's journey. How has he come to be in this place? And I'd love to hear from you in your own words, how did this journey begin for you as someone who is today sought after as a really major voice in the field of grief and loss and bereavement and healing?
Well, that's quite a story. My first experience with death was that I nearly died when I was 3 years old, one of the last cases of polio in the United States. And the fact that I didn't die was miraculous, but it gave me two important realizations. One is that children can die, and the other is that really, because I lived, somewhere at a very core level, I realized that I needed to do something meaningful with my life. Then I think my first major experience with grief was the death of my favorite babysitter, who was this incredible grandmotherly woman. I called her Aunt Mabel. And she was hit and killed by a car crossing the street coming to my house for my birthday party, my 12th birthday. And that was just, it was one of those experiences where the world just falls out from under you. And my parents, during that same time, my parents had reverted to some behavior that they had practiced or experienced before I was born, which was severe alcoholism, both my mother and father. And that creates an extraordinary form of grief in an individual's life, to know that your parents are, you never know who you're going to come home to. You never know what's going to happen. And my father was one of those people who, when he was sober, was the nicest guy in the world, and when he was drinking was the worst demon you've ever met in your life. And I know there are a lot of people watching and listening who have gone through a similar experience. That is an extraordinary form of grief, which started for me when I was 12. So I really got the sense early on that life was very uncertain, that there are many things in life you can't control. I couldn't control my parents' behavior. I couldn't control the fact that Aunt Mabel was killed by a car coming to my birthday party. And then my mother died when I was 18. She contracted, she'd had colon cancer, and then it metastasized into brain cancer. And you know, Ken, it was really the experience of sitting with my mother in 1969, sitting at her bedside when she was dying, that really, really got me interested in doing this work. Because in 1969, there were no hospices.
No.
No one really had heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross yet. People didn't die at home, but my mother insisted, I want to die at home. And I remember the whole family kind of freaking and saying, you know, what's this going to be like? Because the doctor kept saying, you know, you don't want that going on in your house. But he was wrong, you know. I mean, it was an incredibly precious, healing experience. And it was particularly interesting because my mother became aphasic because of the brain tumor, so she couldn't speak. And I didn't know what to say to her, so we would just sit in silence and look in each other's eyes. And the things that I experienced looking in my mother's eyes, just sitting in the silence with her body obviously falling away, that's some of the most precious time I've experienced in this lifetime.
Yes.
And it really led me to, I guess, I didn't realize it at the time, you know, and my mother had just died and I was 18. I didn't think, well, I'd like to help people who are grieving and people who are dying. But that's in fact what wound up being the most attractive thing in my life. And ultimately came through meeting a fellow named Ram Dass, who you and I both know well. And Ram Dass at the time, the early 70s, was working with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And he made the statement that being with people who were dying and people who were grieving, he felt to be the highest spiritual practice he had ever come across.
Yes.
And when I first heard that, I had already reverted to the cultural model of dying and grief. I couldn't figure out what he was talking about, but he suggested that I go study with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And my week with her was the most tremendously transformative week I've spent in this lifetime.
How so?
Well, you know, I think more than anything, I realized that the culture raises us in a very strange way. And that's really what Elizabeth realized. You know, she started out in 1966 by saying, Americans have a very peculiar relationship with death. We like to pretend it doesn't exist. And you know, here we are more than 40 years later, I think that's still the case.
Yes.
Maybe more than ever, in spite of all the great work that she did and other people have done. And what I saw, first of all, superficially, was here was a group of 3,000 people who came together for a conference in Berkeley, California, to talk about the one thing nobody ever wanted to talk about, and everybody was smiling and happy. And I thought, this is fascinating. And everybody felt like this tremendous weight had been lifted, because we were talking about real things. We weren't pretending that reality was other than it was. We were talking about truth and reality and the hardcore experiences.
The elephant in the room had been named.
Exactly. And befriended.
Befriended.
And befriended. So, and the other thing was that personally, I realized that in a workshop that we did during that week, I realized that I had not cried since the early days of my parents drinking when I was 12 years old. And now I was 26. 14 years I hadn't shed a tear, even when my mother died. And because I had realized during the time with my parents drinking that the only way to survive, I thought, as a 12-year-old, was to not feel. And that really is what our culture encourages us to do. Don't feel. Pretend it doesn't exist. Take a drug, drink alcohol, do anything you can do to not feel your feelings.
Are our grieving rituals designed around don't feel? Many
Sure,
of them? How
sure.
so?
I think traditionally, well, I think the fact that, you know, we developed this strange habit of creating funerals that were run by professionals. Now, there are some wonderful professionals in the funeral industry. Again, you and I know many of them, wonderful people who see it as a real ministry.
Yes.
But the fact that we created rituals that separated the family from the actual process, basically saying, this is something that's so painful, you can't deal with it, so hire a professional to deal with it. When in fact, when I've traveled around the world, especially spending time in India, and I got to see how the family participated directly in the funeral ceremonies for even children. And I remember the first time I saw a father carrying his child's body to the cremation ground. The father carrying the body, surrounded by the entire family and the community, supporting him. And the rituals that are done there, which are very much about drawing the community together and keeping the family participating in the ritual.
Yes.
So I think that's really something that we're starting to see in this culture now, is we're seeing families understand the importance of being a part of, you know, a funeral is a transitional ceremony that is every bit as important as a wedding.
Yes.
And yet it's something we've really given short shrift, but it's really about life and death in the family and in the community. And just, you know, getting together for fun at a wedding without getting together for the opening of the heart that a funeral can bring.